starting. Good morning, dear colleagues, dear friends. As we all see, it turns to be a more academic symposium today, since the presenters in the audience is the same group, actually. But anyway, we hope that friends and colleagues are following us through the live streaming. I would like to say a few words trying to sum up a bit regarding yesterday and make some clarifications, which for us are more or less known, but I think it's needed to be done. First of all, Angeliki yesterday tried to make some notes regarding the spirituality of Islam, tasawwuf, etc. So it's necessary for all the people who deal with Bektaşism to know that there is a very important part of Sufi philosophy in this, since a big part of the Bektaşis are a tariqat. I don't know if we can characterize all the Alevi Bektashi community as a tariqat. But we have to have in mind that we have tasawwuf at the back, which is an approach, a philosophical approach, which has certain implementations in the everyday life. Tasawwuf actually is started as an attempt of some certain people who have some certain worries in order to communicate with God. So it was an alternative and deeper, let's say, approach to the typical religion. I think for the time being this is enough. The second is that when we talk about Bektaşism, we don't, Alevism, Bektaşism, actually we are talking about two separate things which are joined in some points. Actually, in the Alevism, Bektaşism, we have two big branches. The Babayan branch, which are the sons and the grandsons of Haji Bektaş, but spiritual sons and grandsons, and the Çelebi branch, which are the bloodline of considered to be bloodline of Haji Bektaş Veli. Yesterday we had the representatives of the Pirevi from the Ulusoy family, who are the people who keep the silsila, the lineage of the bloodline. But at the same time, there are the Bektaşis who are the Babayan branch, who are the spiritual sons of Haji Bektaş Veli. At that part, we find the tasawwuf and the tariqat. Nowadays, only a few people can name themselves as Bektaşis of this type. Out of Albania, of course, because in Albania the situation is different. The Bektaşi, there is, in a way, an official religion. But in my understanding, not in the depth of the... anyway, in the depth. I would expect to be. So we have two different things, common main principles, but different behaviors. All the tekes we refer were connected to the Babayan branch. And I will show you later more elements regarding the tekes in Greece. The people who were yesterday here are actually from the Alevi branch. There is a difference in my understanding. The Babayan branch is an elaborated thing, let's say scholar, while at the same time the Alevi branch is a rural approach, which carries more elements regarding the everyday rural life, while the Babayan branch has a certain typical behavior. Actually, for the people who have some kind of familiarization with Christianity, the Babayan branch and the tekes look like a monastery, as regarding the structure. Anyway, so these are two clarifications. We are at your disposal, at our disposal, as it seems, we are at our disposal to discuss such things. Yeah. I welcome you again, and now the floor is to the Vangelis and the Spanish.
Thank you very much, Yorgos. First of all, I would kindly ask you all to put your mobile phones on silent mode. Σας παρακαλώ, αν είναι εύκολο, να κλείσετε τα κινητά σας. So now we go to the second panel of the symposium, which is a very fascinating issue of the relationship between the state and Alevi's Bektaşism, which is one of the most important dynamic through the ages that continues until today. So I'll give the floor to Mrs. Yulay Yilmaz, who will talk us about the connections between the Bektaşis and the Janissary Corps. Thank you very much.
Okay, you hear me? Today I will be presenting on the intriguing relationship between Bektaşism and the Janissary Army. And the focus will be on Istanbul and from, let's say, the beginning of the Janissary Army until 1826, that the Janissary Army was abolited. Delving into this topic poses significant challenges due to the scarcity of archives that provide information on Bektashi communities, as well as the functioning and structure of Bektashi lodges. Also, the Ottoman archives are notably deficient in documentation related to the Janissary Army, with many records deliberately destroyed during the abolition of the Janissaries in 1826. During this time, several Bektashi lodges were either closed, demolished, transformed into Naqshbandi lodges, or subjected to stricter control along with the abolition of the army. The silenced Bektashi communities, coupled with the intentional destruction of records, has made this topic even more challenging. This multidimensional silence underscores the need for a more meticulous examination of historical archives, sometimes requiring historians to connect the dots with their insights. Historians are accustomed to dealing with silent groups and elusive archives, but my personal experience recently disclosed the extent of this silence. I recently discovered that my maternal grandparents, who immigrated to Turkey from Bulgaria in the 1930s, were followers of Demirbaba Lodge in Silistre. And unfortunately, this tradition did not survive their migration and was not passed down to future generations. And this actually, for me, highlights the depth of the silence was out of my grasp. In the light of these challenges, today I will begin discussing the possible emotional and mental mental influence of Bektashi beliefs on the formation of the early modern Janissary warriors. Then I will examine the presence of Bektashi Janissaries in Istanbul, especially with the urbanization of the soldiers in the 17th century. And finally, I will take a brief look at the possible connection of Janissaries and the Bektashi lodges in general. Opinions differ on when the close relationship between the Bektashi sect and the Janissary army began. Hacı Bektaş died long before the foundation of the Ottoman state, and therefore it's unlikely that he was present during the foundation of the army. Some scholars date this close relationship to the period when the Janissary army was founded, others to the beginning of the 15th centuries, or some scholars to the end of the 16th century. So even the origins of the relationship is not very clearly known. Janissaries were predominantly recruited during their adolescence, became first Acemi Oğlans, and then entered to the Janissary regiments within the early structure of the army. During this passage, the young boys who entered the warrior organization were transformed by strong codes of brotherhood, martial prowess, and discipline, got integrated into a strict hierarchical operation and interrelated belief system, Bektaşism, that set the tone of ceremonies, rituals, and notions of fighting for a religion and possible martyrdom. It is important to mention that not all Janissaries were followers of the Bektashi sect, whereas the codes and figures of mystical Islam in general, I forgot to, okay. Sorry, the codes and figures of mystical Islam in general, which also had important roles in Bektaşism, were crucial in building a Janissary identity. The spiritual leader of the Janissary army was accepted to be Hacı Bektaş Veli, and the Janissaries in the accounts were referred as Zümre-i Bektaşiyan, Bektaşi oğulları, Hacı Bektaş köçekleri, and other synonyms like that. The 94th Regiment of the army, Hukeşan, were Bektashi dervishes, responsible for praying day and night for the victory of the army and praying at ceremonies. Gülbanks were part of the Janissary ceremonies and recited before going on campaigns and or during assaults. In searching for the connection between the Janissaries and Bektashis, I examined the works of Bektashi Janissary poets, as they were an important part of the folk literature in the 16th and 17th centuries. These poets' works also were sung in the barracks, on the battlefields, and in fortresses in the 15th and 16th centuries, and had influence on soldiers. Symbolic elements of the Bektashi prayers were present in these poems. They generally mention the Prophet Muhammad, Prophet Ali, the 12 Imams, and the forces of supernatural world referred to as üçler, beşler, yediler, kırklar. The Prophet Ali was the most important figure representing martyrdom and bravery, often described with his sword, Zülfikar, and his horse called Düldül. For example, Çırpanlı declares in his verses that their leader saint was Hacı Bektaş. He was one of the few soldier poets in the 16th century whose poems have survived to this day. He served under Murat Reis in Algiers and the Mediterranean, is accepted to have been a Devşirme recruit from Çırpan in Filibe by literary historians. Another poet, Armutlu, who also served under Murat Reis, in one of his few surviving poems said, "Those were the days the Prophet Ali wrote Düldül, indicating that it was time for war, and wrote in his verses that Imam Hüseyin Hasan was martyred in Karbala." Another figure, Mansur el-Hallaj, the famous mystic of Islam and Amart, has been a symbol for many mystics who seek God. The Gıbet of Hallaj was part of the initiation rite of the Bektashis, and it was frequently referenced by the poets of the Janissary army. A famous Janissary poet, Kul Mustafa, who fought in the army of Sultan Murat, shows in his poem that the Gülbank or Bektashi prayers provided important moral support for the Janissaries when they charged at their enemies. Janissary Bektashi poets became a more important part of urban culture in the Ottoman capital in the 17th century. Their poems were put to music and performed by poets themselves, accompanied by traditional stringed instruments such as saz or çökür, in many venues, from coffee houses, taverns, millet drinking places, to the lodges of religious sects, mansions of the rich, and open spaces such as promenade spots and outdoor festivals. Naima's description of 8 of these Janissary poets reflects how glorious they were in the public's eye. He writes that 8 Janissary poets walked in front of the Grand Vizier İpşir Pasha and Müftü Ebu Said Efendi, wearing keche, a type of felt hat, on their heads and tiger skins on their backs. They walked by the imperial palace playing their chokers and singing songs with lofty voices. Naima describes them as tall and strong, giant-like men whose song could be heard from a great distance. Urban spaces such as coffee houses, taverns, millet drinking places were more than entertainment places. They were playing the role of intersection points where news on the politics of the palace and campaigns was disseminated and oppositional voices were raised. The Janissaries not only frequented these spaces but opened their own coffee houses from the 17th century onwards, some having opening ceremonies with the presence of a Bektashi sheikh. This integration of the Janissaries with the Istanbulites deepened economically, socially, and politically throughout the 18th and early 19th century. On the other hand, when we look at the relationship with the Janissary regiments and the Bektashi lodges, this is a field that is not very well known. However, it seems that the Janissary regiments and the Bektashi lodges became more closely connected in the 16th century when Beyazıt II brought Balım Sultan from Dimetoka to Kırşehir in order to reorganize and centralize the Hacı Bektaş Veli Lodge in the empire. It's known that Janissaries and Acemi Oğlans participated in the celebrations at the Seyit Gazi Türbe every year and provided protection. The head of the 94th Regiment of the Janissary Army, where the Bektashi dervishes reside, was appointed by the Bektashi Sheikh in Kırşehir, who was also present at the ceremony that the dervish became a member of the Janissary Army. Also, a document I found in the archives from 1702 shows that the appointment of the Hacı Bektaş Veli Lodge in Kırşehir was made at the request of the Janissary Ağa, which indicates a strong institutional connection. The Bektashi lodges in Istanbul, on the other hand, mostly trace their origins to the conquest of the city. Most of them have an oral tradition that speaks of an Abdal or Eren who was present during the conquest and became the sheikh of that particular lodge. However, the exact date of their foundation is generally unknown. It's probable that some of the old Bektashi lodges in Istanbul were established during or after the reign of Beyazıt II, the period which the Bektashis institutionalized the sect in Istanbul, actually similar to others such as the Halveti, Bayrami, and Nakşibendi orders. Among the old Bektashi lodges in Istanbul are the Mehmet Baba Lodge around the Yedikule Gate, Karaağaç in Sütlice Kasımpaşa, the Şehitlik Lodge in Rumeli Hisarı, Şahkulu in Merdivenköy Üsküdar, and Yarımca Baba Lodge in Paşa Limanı, Karyadı Baba Lodge in Eyüp. The relatively newer lodges in Istanbul were the Kıncı Baba, that was founded in 1803, it's Vakıf, and Tahir Baba lodges, also that is founded in 1798, and they were both in Üsküdar. It is noteworthy that these lodges were typically located outside the city center, and some of them were strategically positioned. Yarımca Baba and Şehitlik lodges controlled the entrance of Bosphorus, and Mehmet Baba Lodge was close to Yedikule Fortress, where there was a significant number of Janissaries. Examining the depth of the relationship between the lodges and the Janissaries in Istanbul is challenging because very few documents have survived. For example, with some of these lodges, while some of these lodges are known to have existed as we read them in Evliya Çelebi's writings, official documents only mention them at the time of their closure and destruction in 1826, or soon before, such as Yarımca Baba Lodge. We have this lack of evidence. With the abolition of the Janissary army, the majority of these lodges are closed, and some of the sheikhs were sent to exile. I won't go into detail, probably Jay will talk about that. But I'd like to finish with one example, the connection between the Janissaries and Bektashis, as well as between the regiments and lodges, was far more vibrant than what the destroyed Ottoman state archives or the demolished lodges reveal. This vibrant network is clearly evident in a document related to a Janissary plot discovered 4 months after the abolition of the Janissary army by the government. This document was initially published by İsmail Hakkı Uzunçarşılı and was later thoroughly elaborated upon by Mert Sunar in an article. The document consists of interrogation records of 29 individuals who were arrested and interrogated for plotting against the government. Among these, 8 were Asakiri Mansuriye soldiers, 6 were Kalyoncus, 9 were former Janissaries, and some civilians. The rumors of the rebellion were initiated by a former Janissary and Bektashi dervish named Ahmet, who owned a pipe bowl shop, so typically an artisan. Another person involved was Ahmet's Bektashi Sheikh, Mehmet Efendi, who managed to secretly remain in Istanbul after the abolition. He revealed a prophecy that 12,000 Bektashis armed with halberds would arrive in Üsküdar from Mecca and gather in the Mid Square, the famous square at the Janissary barracks where the famous rebellions usually began. And these rumors spread through several social networks. For example, soldiers in the Asakiri Mansuri army who were from the same town and neighborhood, the Bektashi dervishes, and another network consisted of the members of the 75th Regiment of the former Janissary army, one of them being Mehmet Bayraktar, who ran a coffee house in Üsküdar. The discovery of the rebellion plan resulted in another round of manhunt for Janissaries and Bektashis in Istanbul, leading to many deaths and the expulsion of 800 individuals from the city. So in conclusion, this invaluable interrogation record of the plot strongly confirms the deep historical connections that were established among the Janissaries and Bektashis, regiments, lodges, and coffee houses in Istanbul. And it also suggests that the reason for the silence of Bektashi communities extended beyond the destroyed archives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gülay, for shedding light in this so complicated issue. And I'll give the floor to Mr. Cem Kara, who will go a step further in history and will talk about the dismantlement of the Bektashi networks in Turkey. Thank you very much, Cem.
Let me open the presentation. Many thanks, Evangelos, for the introduction, and to Yorgos and Zeynep Hoca for organizing this interesting, fascinating symposium and for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that was part of my doctoral thesis, so it's been some years I've engaged with it. However, I'm very much looking forward to revisiting this topic and discussing it with you. Following on directly from Gülay Hoca's presentation, I would like to outline the history of the Bektashi order after 1826, the year in which the Bektashi order was officially banned by the Ottoman state. Given the short time available, I can only sketch the broad outlines of the development in order to reconstruct larger processes. The paper is divided into two main parts. First, I will discuss the state's policy towards the Bektashis from 1826 to the end of the Tanzimat. Secondly, I will look at the impact of this policy on the Bektashis and in particular on their religious self-understanding. In 1826, in a bloody event, Sultan Mahmud II had the elite corps of Janissaries liquidated for opposing the planned military reforms of the empire. Despite the violence, this event has been described in Ottoman historiography as an auspicious incident, Vakaya Hayriye. In the course of this abolition, the Bektashi order was also prohibited. Different researchers have speculated about the Ottoman Empire's possible motives for abolishing the Bektashi order along with the Janissaries, ranging from the connection to the Janissaries to economic and religious motives. Regardless of the actual intentions of the state, the Ottoman state argued in religious categories in its official documents. In various sultan decrees, the Bektashis were accused in particular of disregarding the Sharia and of their allegedly extreme Alite views. Accordingly, the Bektashis had distanced themselves from the name giver of their order, Hacı Bektaş Veli, whom the Ottoman state always honored in its decrees. The pro-state chronicler Esat Efendi also cited religious arguments in his justifying chronicle of the liquidation of the Janissaries and the abolition of the Bektashis. Accordingly, the Janissaries were, I quote, the enemy of the state and the Bektashis the enemy of religion. Birisi düşmeni devlet, birisi düşmeni din. Thus, after 1826, the ban of 1826, the Ottoman state actively spread pejorative narratives about the Bektashis. In this endeavor, the state was supported by ulema authors who used religious polemics against the Bektashis as an important medium to spread polarizing and repulsive narratives about the Bektashis. Although disparaging ideas about the Bektashis had a long tradition, they became harsher in tone and content after 1826 and significantly shaped the discourse about the Bektashis and the Ottoman Empire of the 19th century. Content-wise, these pejorative narratives about the Bektashis can be divided into three categories. First, Bektashis were discredited on a religious level as heretics who had abandoned Sunnah and Sharia in favor of extreme Alite views. Secondly, this alleged inability to follow religious commandments would lead to moral misconducts, culminating in accusations of sexual deviance. These kinds of defamation are also known from other regions, and the discrimination against religious minority in order to cause the greatest possible aversion of the vilified group. Ultimately, these accusations led to the view that the Bektashis were a danger to society and state, and that they contributed to the decline of the empire. So the state had to take harsh measures against them. The Bektashis faced various discriminations on religious, moral, and political level, which were meant to explicitly exclude them from the circle of accepted religions in the Ottoman Empire. Despite some changes throughout the 19th century, the accusations were quite long-lasting and constant. However, discrimination was only the first step that led to a disciplinary approach. In 1826, the Ottoman state did not leave it at discrimination, but initiated various measures of religious disciplining. The original plans to destroy the Bektashi takers were abandoned, also on the recommendation of the Shaykh Islam. Instead, the aim was to transform the Bektashi into true Sunni Muslims. Thus, after the ban, leading Bektashis were exiled to places where the ulema were particularly influential. Moreover, takers were handed over to Sharia and Sunnah compliant Sufi orders, such as the Naqshbandiya, to instruct Bektashis in Sunni Islam. The open goal was to, I quote, to dissolve the malevolence of Bektashism completely within Sunni Islam, end of quote. Accordingly, the state handed over the main tekke in Hacı Bektaş and other tekkes to the Naqshbandiyas, such as the traditional Abd al-Musa tekke in Elmalı and various tekkes in Istanbul. Other Sufi orders also benefited from the ban on the Bektashi order. The Rifaiye took over the Bektashi tekke in Trikala, the Kadiri in Gelibolu and Skopje, Mevlevi in Reni, the Bayramiye in Ankara, and the Halvetiye in Thessaloniki. However, it was mainly the Naqshbandiya who were charged with the religious instruction and disciplining of the Bektashis. The transfer of the Bektashi tekkes to other Sufi orders or other measures taken by the state were not equally consistent throughout the empire. While the Ottoman state was largely able to implement the decrees in Istanbul and surrounding regions, the implementation in peripheral regions was much less consistent. Although we do not have much information, it seems that in the peripheral regions, persecution could not be pursued with the same vehemence because the reach of the state was limited there. Nevertheless, the period from 1826 to 1839 was probably the period in the history of the Bektashis when they suffered most from discrimination and religious disciplinary measures. As this would not change until the reform era of the Tanzimat. The Tanzimat's generally more open religious policy also allowed the Bektashi to rehabilitate their Sufi order to some extent. Some of their tekkes were reactivated and returned to the Bektashis, not de jure, but de facto. Thus, the larger tekkes in Istanbul and also the main tekkes in Hacı Bektaş were again unofficially and practically run by Bektashis. Officially, however, they were run as institutions of the Sufi orders to which the tekkes had previously been handed over. So in most of the cases as tekkes of the Naqshbandiya. During the Tanzimat, the Bektashi also took advantage of the improved publication opportunities and published works that they attributed to their religious tradition. As a result, they regained visibility. The transmission of Bektashi tekkes to other Sufi orders also intensified the exchange between Bektashis and other Sufi orders. Thus, there's much evidence from the Tanzimat era of cultural exchange between Bektashis and other Sufi orders. For instance, there were numerous interactions with Sufi orders, with Bektashis being recorded as joining the Naqshbandis, Mevlevis, Melamis, Rifais, or vice versa. In particular, contacts and exchanges with the Rifais can be reconstructed for the mid-19th century. A proverb dating to the period after 1826 states that the Bektashi touch, meaning the Bektashi cap, is hidden under a Rifai touch, alluding to a secret attachment to the Bektashis under the guise of the Rifaiya. The saying suggests that many Rifais were secretly Bektashi, and in some cases can be proven. For example, we know that some Rifai sheikhs tried to introduce some Bektashi doctrines into the Rifai order, and how this provoked harsh reactions from the religious followers of the Rifais. And the exchange between Rifai and Bektashi would even lead to the amalgamation of the tradition of the two traditions into a Sufi subgroup called Marifiye. And this subgroup crystallized in the mid-19th century in the Aegean region, combining the liturgy, ritual dress, and practices of the Rifai and Bektashis. They established a small network of tekkes in the Aegean region and also in Istanbul. However, it was precisely this increasing networking of the Bektashis with other Sufi orders, their partial visibility through reactivated tekkes and publications, that provoked strong reactions from the ulema critical of the Bektashis, leading to a new wave of polemics. In this context, the polemic of Harputli Issa Koca is particularly noteworthy, whose aggressiveness, radicalism, and defamation overshadowed all other polemics. At the same time, this polemic had a wide reach, so that the aforementioned pejorative narratives remained virulent. So in general, the Tanzimat period can be interpreted as an ambivalent phase in which, on the one hand, the Bektashis were able to reactivate their tekkes and publish some texts of their religious tradition. On the other hand, there was further, albeit less severe, religiously legitimized discrimination by the state, and the ban was not lifted but remained in force. More importantly, however, was that this period of rehabilitation led to an increase in attacks against the Bektaşis by ulema authors. Particularly in the final phase of the Tanzimat, ulema authors published fierce polemics against the Bektaşis, taking the mentioned pejorative narratives to the extreme. When the state became less vehement against the Bektaşis than it had been in previous decades, the Bektashi critical ulema maintained and sometimes even intensified the pejorative discourse about the Bektaşis. To put it simple, what the state lost in vehemence was maintained by the ulema. Now, coming to my second part of the paper, so what was the reaction of the Bektaşis to this policy of discrimination and disciplining? And dealing with this determined the history of the Bektashi order in this period hardly like any other topic did. Among many problems and conflicts, it led to various processes of religious negotiation within the Bektashi order. These negotiation processes began during the Tanzimat, but continued into the Young Turk period up to the establishment of the Republic. While some Bektaşis further reinforced the difference to Sunni interpretations of Islam and distanced themselves further from them by emphasizing non-conformist and antinomian ideas, others sought an approach to Sunni Hanafi Islam. They argued, in turn, that the Bektashi was in conformity with Sunni interpretations of Islam and thus part of the Ahli Sunnah. In this context, publications are an important key to reconstructing the performative negotiation processes. The first writings that can be proven to have been published by Bektaşis date back to the early Tanzimat. Bektaşis took advantage of the less strict policies of the Tanzimat to publish several religious works and anthologies of poets they considered to be part of their tradition. What is striking about these publications during the early Tanzimat is that they are predominantly works that clearly do not conform to Sunni interpretations of Islam and reinforced religious boundaries with Sunnism. Either works with a clear and distinct Alid, sometimes even Shiite tendency, or works in the Hurufi tradition. In particular, works with Hurufi content were suspected of heresy during this period, which makes the publication of a relatively large number of works from this tradition by Bektaşis quite revealing. One could go so far as to say that the first works published were primarily those that drew the strongest line of demarcation to Sunnism. Thus, until the end of the 1860s, a non-conformist tendency dominated the performative actions of the Bektaşis, emphasizing in particular the dissociation from Sunni interpretations of Islam. These very publications then triggered another wave of polemics in the 1870s. As mentioned before, from the 1870s onwards, polemics against the Bektaşis became more vehement and widespread. The polemic of Ishaq Hoxha played a major role in this. In response to these accusations, a more conformist approach prevailed, which actively and clearly sought a closeness to Sunnism. For example, different agents wrote direct responses to the polemics and attempted to refute the accusations made there. In doing so, the authors took a multi-dimensional approach. Firstly, they emphasized that the commandments and prohibitions of the Sharia also apply to Bektaşis, and actively discredited those Bektaşis who would break these rules. Secondly, they incorporated teachings that can be read as Sunni as part of the Bektaşiya in order to present it as a Sunnah-compliant Sufi order. The most conspicuous of these are attempts to trace the silsila tradition of the Bektaşiya through Abu Bakr rather than Imam Ali. As you all know, silsilas are chains of traditions traced back through generations of student-teacher relations, going all the back to the Prophet Muhammad, and are thus a central means of religious authority. In most Sufi orders in the Ottoman Empire, even those that consider themselves decidedly as Sunni, this lineage ran through Imam Ali. the fact that the Bektaşiye as an allied denomination used Abu Bakr as a starting point of its religious legitimacy seems almost overcompensating and made it even more Sunni than other Sufi orders. Thirdly, they deliberately omitted issues and practices that could potentially cause conflict or emphasize differences with Sunnism, such as the 1826 ban or ritual practices of the Bektashi order, such as the Meydan or Sofra, which could be considered as not conforming to Sunni interpretations. All this indicates that some Bektashis took the comparatively politically more favorable phase during the Tanzimat as an opportunity to publish rather non-conformist teachings. The fierce reaction of Sunni critics, most notably Ishaq Hojas, may then have largely pushed back the non-conformist approach and performative activities. Conversely, the re-emergence of polemics induced conformist Bektashis to pursue performative closeness to Sunni Islam. The observations so far have mainly referred to performative approaches, mostly by intellectual and higher representatives of the Bektashis. With such performative approaches aimed at a larger, primarily Sunni audience, there's of course always a question of intention, which in this case was clearly an attempt at rehabilitation. This is why some scholars, such as Birch, have described this pro-Sunni approach as a taqiyya strategy to rehabilitate the Bektaşiye. By taqiyya, these authors mean the feigned denial of one's actual religious affiliation and the apparent adoption of the discourse determining in order to escape persecution, while secretly remaining to the original belief. And indeed, the general argumentation cannot be dismissed out of hand. One indication of this is that some agents who publicly appear to be particularly pro-Sunni and demonized the Hurufiyya wrote privately poetry entirely in the Hurufi tradition. In general, such non-conformist approaches can be found in non-performative, close contexts, for instance, in private notebooks throughout the 19th century. However, the attempts of many Bektashis to establish a Sharia and Sunnah-compliant Bektashi interpretation should not be reduced exclusively to political calculation, as many Bektashi had apparently internalized these ideas. And these internalization processes have resulted also from the mentioned cultural contacts and exchanges with other Sufi orders. This brings me to the end of my presentation, my conclusion. After the ban of 1826, the Ottoman state pursued a double strategy of discrimination and disciplining. On the one hand, in coalition with ulema authors, Bektashis were discriminated against as a religiously heretical, morally corrupt, and sociopolitically dangerous group and excluded from the circle of accepted religions. However, the state did not stop at discrimination, but introduced various measures of religious disciplining towards Sunnitization. A central measure in this context was the transfer of Bektashi tekkes to Sharia and Sunnah-compliant Sufi orders. While this dual strategy was not applied or enforced with the same rigor throughout the empire, it was a constant feature of state policy towards the Bektashis until the Tanzimat. During the Tanzimat, however, there was a limited rehabilitation in which the Bektashi reactivated their tekkes, at least unofficially. In addition, the Bektashis took advantage of the Tanzimat's less restrictive policy to publish works on their belief. This newfound visibility then unleashed a new wave of religious polemics, even harsher in tone and content than those after 1826. In phases, and this can basically be observed until the beginning of the 20th century, when the state policy became comparatively a bit more less restrictive, the attacks of the ulema increased, so that the pejorative discourse about the Bektashis remained relatively constant. The Bektashis responded on this combination of discrimination and disciplining in different ways. As a result, religious negotiation took place in which the Bektashis oscillated between rapprochement with Sunni Islam and demarcation. Of course, it's not surprising that in a religious group as socially and regionally diverse as the Bektaşiye, there are also different religious positions. The same applies to representatives of Sunni Islam, who of course were not monolithically opposed to Bektashis. Even there are very, very few openly addressed voices that spoke out in favor of the Bektashis. We know that often the direct interaction was less conflictual. All observations can therefore only be made with the reservation of the ideal type, in which certain aspects are emphasized in order to recognize larger developments. My attempt was therefore, has therefore been to identify ideal typical tendencies, mainly in performative actions and how they have transformed with changing political and discursive settings. And it seems that the Bektashis' first reaction to post-ban discrimination was to draw even stronger boundaries by spreading rather non-conformist ideas. The strong reaction of the ulama critics may have largely pushed back the non-conformist approach and performative activity. Conversely, the re-emergence of polemics induced the performative proximity to Sunni Islam. And this oscillation between conformity and non-conformity determined the history of the Bektashi order also for the next decades. Yeah, with that, I'm at the end of my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jem, for all this valuable insight, and especially this oscillation between conformity and non-conformity, which is probably one of the most fascinating aspects of Bektashism. And I'll give the floor to Mrs. Zeynep Türk-Yılmaz, who will talk about this complicated period of the Abdul Hamid II, the Hamidian period, and how the Bektashi Alevi communities managed to cope with this period. Thank you very much, Zeynep.
So, yeah, thank you so much, Vangeli, for taking care of all of this. As one of the organizers and I guess gang members, I would like to first of all welcome all of you here, participants, for coming and being with us, sharing their research, and also our guest for staying the second day after a very full first day. I feel very happy to be particularly on this panel with, you know, such wonderful papers. So what I'll try to do today is actually, I will try to discuss three cases I have gathered documents about over the years. I worked on some of them in more detail. Some of them are still at the very preliminary stage, but I would like to provide an overview of the Bektashi Alevi lives, especially those who are challenging the more mainstream or orthopraxy, even within the Alevi Bektashi communities in the late 19th century, in the Hamidian period. So these three communities are, I'll first start with, I hope I'm doing the right one. Mehmet Tevfik Baba in Kırklareli, who was based in Tekke Şehler and was an initiated Bektashi Baba. The second group I'm going to talk about is going to be from Tokat Zile, Anşa Bacılılar, who again was seen in the Ottoman, very heavily in the Ottoman documentation, among the Ottoman documents, in 1880s, the second half of 1880s. And finally, I'll talk about Araboğlu Tekkesi, or those are pejoratively known as Prots, around Sivas Kangal, again, the same period. So actually, Ottoman historians particularly like talking about the Hamidian period. It reflects some of the ills, actually, of our Ottoman historians, because Ottoman historians really like talking about the states, really talking about state centers, the capitals, big cities, urban life, and they also like to talk about, powerful sultans' period. So actually, Abdul Hamid's period ticks all these fantasies about the Ottoman Empire. Whereas, I'll also talk about Hamidian period for a different reason, actually. Maybe, outcomes of these features I've just mentioned. Abdülhamid's period was, Abdülhamid II's period was quite interesting for researchers because it leaves a lot of documentation. So for any community you are looking into, there are a number of documents you can find from informants, which I'll talk in more detail, from the Ottoman officials talking about these groups. So it in a way makes it very convenient for historians to research on these even muted or communities that excelled in hiding themselves from the reach of the state. The second one is obviously Hamidian period is perhaps not a period of flourishing or rebuilding themselves for the Kızılbaş Alevi communities, but one of surveillance. So this surveillance again tells us a lot about the strategies that was developed by the Ottoman state and organized and better informed strategy to suppress these communities, which I argue actually were quite vibrant in the period that actually Cem was just talking about. So Abdülhamid period marks in a way more of a survival strategy for the communities that I'll talk about and not necessarily flourishing. So first I will start with Mehmet Tevfik Baba, who actually who was the son of a Nakshi Bandi father, whose family came from Crimea, and his father got the property where these Arız Baba and Kamber Baba tekkes existed. Basically, he lost his father. Tevfik Baba lost his father when he was 9, and inherited this land with the already existing tekkes on his land at the age of 9. So later in his life, he was initiated as a Bektashi Baba with connections to Rumeli Hisarı tekke, and became a well-known Bektashi Baba, who was known as the Sheikh of Arız Baba. One of the first documents, at least I can locate about Tevfik Baba, comes as an kind of a discontent, kind of an informant complaining about Tevfik Baba's seditious activities in the late 1880s, although we know that from his interrogation, actually, his activities dates earlier than 1880s. And in this brief interrogation record that you again find in the Ottoman archives, Mehmet Tevfik Baba accepted that actually there are tekkes, existing shrines, Bektashi shrines on his land, and as the owner of this land, he is providing food and room for the visitors of these shrines. He himself is an initiated Bektashi, but he's not a leader of any kind of movement. He doesn't, he doesn't run any ayini Cem. He was basically simply an ordinary Bektashi, initiated Bektashi that basically provides food and hospitality because he's the property owner. And he claimed that he's called the Sheikh of Arız Baba because of this property relation and not because of any of the activities he's engaging in. Also, while he was mentioning, when he was responding to the interrogators' questions, very detailed questions about his activities. Again, he denied, as I said, any kind of seditious activity, but he said the visitors of the shrine included, the notables in the environs of the Kırklareli Edirne, but also state officials such as, Zevat Kiram, prominent figures of the state, like the deceased Muhlis Pasha, judge of Edirne Ruhi Bey or the secretary chief Ali Bey. So he definitely mentions these big names as the regular followers of the tekke. So unfortunately, his interrogation did not help his case, and then the decision was already taken that he should be exiled to Tripoli in 1883, and 6 years later, he died in Tripoli in exile. And I will leave the story here, but we'll come back to that later on. The second group I'll talk about is a quite interesting story because it's one of those rare cases even for now. We mostly talk about babas, we mostly talk about dedes, but we hardly talk about anas, right? The role of women in the Bektashi Alevi communities. And Ansha Bacılılar, or that are still known as, her name was Ayşe Bacı, but is locally known as Ansha Bacılılar, were a group that was gathered around a female figure who, according to the Ottoman documentation, who made a claim to deity, so claimed to be a god or having performed the features of God. And obviously that comes with a very pejorative language in the documentation, but the story of Ansha Bacılılar is quite interesting and goes back to, again, 1826 and the separation and the policies of the state that came after that. And obviously, there was this dynamic that Cem just mentioned between conformism, oscillation between conformism and non-conformism. And Ayşe Bacı's deceased husband, Veli Baba, took the side of non-conformity and quite angry with his fellow Beydilli Saraç, some of whom actually decided to go for a more conformist approach and broke away from them and formed their own rituals and order around Veli Baba. But Veli Baba died fairly early, leaving Ayşe Bacı with 3 sons and 2 daughters. This will all become very relevant very soon. So according to interrogation record again, and the reports submitted from the provinces to the state, Ayşe Bacı and these Sıraçlar were quiet for a brief time after Veli Baba's death, but then they began to organize around Ayşe Bacı, who again made a claim that his last son, Hasan, was born 2 years after the death of her husband. So again, this myth about promiscuity, right, of especially the Kızılbaş woman, suggesting that she was engaging in extramarital affair after the death of her husband. To cover up, according to the Ottoman officials, this kind of promiscuous behavior, she came up with the lie that the youngest son is actually Mehdi. So was born obviously after her husband for that particular reason. And around the 1880s, she began to send her all 3 sons and one of the son-in-laws as the representatives of her order. According to these documents, again, they were collecting donations, and then they were forcing people to come under the felt cap and give their submission and obedience to Ansha Bacılı, and if they do not, they were threatened with harsh punishment. Again, the scare that comes very strongly in this documentation is that these Ansha Bacılılar were expanding in numbers, and their influence went beyond Tokat and approaching to different parts of Sivas, where a significant Kızılbaş population already existed. And these Ayşe Bacılılar were armed and might be actually plotting an uprising against the Ottoman state and perhaps first against their Sunni neighbors. Ayşe Bacı and her entire family was brought to the interrogation room, They were questioned about their beliefs, about the claims made by the local Sunni communities. And very much like Mehmet Tevfik Baba, she and her sons and son-in-law all denied all the charges about running Ayin-i Cem, holding ceremonies, gathering donations, or carrying any kind of religious activity except being, a good believer. And she also denied the charge that her son was born after the death of her husband. And she actually took a step further. And not only she denied carrying any of this activity or, claiming any, arguing that she's not leader of any sort, she actually claimed that she herself is from the Hanifi followers of Imam Azam and the followers of Ebu Hanefi. So denied any kind of Kızılbaş or Alevi or Bektashi attachment. However, this didn't really do any good to her. Again, it seemed like there was already a commitment to send her to exile as well. Ayşe Bacı, together with her son Hassan Hussein Ali and his son-in-law Ibrahim, was this time sent to Damascus, where she spent almost a year sending an arzuhal, a petition, saying that basically all these neighbors are, is committing libel and slanders. We are not Alit, we are not followers of Ali, we are followers of Ebu Hanefi, and we are not engaged in any kind of seditious activity. Please send us back. I mean, that is a usual activity, but what is quite interesting is also a petition, an arzihal, submitted from Kasımpaşa by the dockyard workers who were coming from, at least, significant part of them were coming from Tokat, which was confirmed by the local muhtar and imam. And they submitted a petition for the release of Anşa Bacı from the exile. Quite interestingly, there were back and forth also among the Ottoman officials. Some of them said this document itself actually proves that Ayşe Bacı's influence is going beyond Tokat, so that should be, they should be very careful. But the governor of Sivas, quite interestingly, wrote a very endearing, actually, report about Anşa Bacı, and said basically she's a helpless woman, doesn't have a capacity to seduce anyone or plot any kind of rebellion. And these are sade değil Kızılbaş. These are people coming from naive Kızılbaş background, so they should be coming back. And they did. I think like a year in Damascus. The final community I will briefly talk about is Araboğlu Tekkesi. Comes from Sivas Kangal, very close to where my parents are from. And I also heard the name Prot from my family, not in a very endearing way, I have to admit. There were all kinds of rumors about the practices of these Prot communities, and I was quite puzzled about, what Prot, the term Prot entailed itself. And later on, in the missionary archives, I came across with this document about Kızılbaş Kurds who were in interaction with the local missionaries, local American missionaries, and were asking their help in terms of educating their community and learning more about their religion. And this is actually, the one on the left comes from the missionary archives and the notebook of Henry Perry, one of the missionaries, who didn't hold very high views about this community. He didn't really trust Kızılbaş or other or Muslim communities in Sivas. He wasn't very happy missionary in Sivas for his own personal history, but he visited all these villages where the Araboğlu Tekke held grounds and listed their activities in his notebooks. Araboğlu Tekke seems to come from Dersim. Again, the split was experienced again about as an aftershocks of 1826 split. and had to do with how the ritual should be carried out, and particularly about use of tariq or not, this religious, I don't want to say stick, but tariq. Tariq, yeah, the use of tariq in the Ayin-i Cem, they broke away. But this breaking away was not as simply breaking away with the use of tariq, but went beyond that. They refused the hierarchy of the dedes, they refused the ocak structure, and they began to actually, again, this is an information that comes through, mostly through missionaries who were sometimes favorable and sometimes not so favorable to these communities, but they began to think about their own tradition vis-a-vis these new ideas about religiosity that came with the American missionaries. So one of the things that they told quite often, like what Zeynep mentioned yesterday, about the similarities between Jesus and Ali, and then they also started talking about, you know, the lokma, and the mess and the sharing of the sacred food, blessing of the food. But more interestingly, I guess, and more particularly in this group, which makes it very interesting for me, is that their use of the concept, the city of consent, that is obviously has a very, very long history in the Alevi Bektashi tradition, and they resembled it to the early Christians, where there was no private property. And they said, we should rekindle this kind of lifestyle, this kind of lifestyle, and they actually denied private property. Up until 1960s, they refused to have separations within their villages in terms of their lands. So it all turned into communal property and refused the dedes and orders. So, so what does it tell us about the Ottoman state? I think I'm really running out of time. So I'll briefly make a few points. First of all these stories tell us that in this period, we see in a consolidation of an ethnographic state that wants to know about their Alevi Kızılbaş subject, not only about them, but since we are talking about Alevi Kızılbaş subject today, they want to know about the non-conformity in details. So all these reports, all these documents about individual groups always included details about how many people, from which villages, what are their names, and you can see, you know, these are from different files of these Anşabacılılar, Tevfik Baba's followers, and so this ethnographic state was not limited